I still remember the weight of that day crushing me like a wave I never saw coming. My heart shattered in silence when I realized my husband's golf trip was just a lie. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret. I'm 72 years old, and for 53 years, I believed I was living a blessed life. Every morning in our 3-bedroom house in Queens, I would wake to the sound of the number 7 train rattling past our window at 6:15 sharp. The same sound that had been my alarm clock for decades. I'd slip my feet into the worn terry cloth slippers Harold bought me for our 20th anniversary, wrap my faded blue robe around my shoulders, and pad across the cold linoleum floor to start the coffee. The routine never changed. 2 scoops of Folgers, fill the pot with water, wait for the familiar gurgle that meant another day was beginning. Harold would lumber down the stairs 10 minutes later, already dressed in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, hair combed with the same side part he'd worn since Vietnam. He'd grunt his good morning, grab his coffee, and disappear behind the Wall Street Journal like a magician's curtain. But that Tuesday morning in October, everything shifted. The autumn light filtered through our kitchen curtains, casting long shadows across the cracked Formica countertop. Harold had left for his monthly golf weekend in the Hamptons the night before, kissing my forehead with the same distracted affection he'd shown for years. Nothing felt different. Nothing seemed wrong. Until I saw his laptop. Harold never left his laptop open. Never. In 30 years of owning computers, that man treated his Dell like it contained state secrets. He'd snap it shut if I so much as walked near the kitchen table where he worked on his finances every evening after dinner. But there it sat, screen glowing, cursor blinking on what looked like a banking website. I shouldn't have looked. I know that now. But something in my chest, some instinct I'd buried under decades of being a good wife, whispered that I needed to see. My hand trembled as I pulled out the wooden chair, the one with the wobbly leg that Harold always promised to fix. The screen was filled with numbers, accounts I'd never seen before, transactions that made my stomach drop to the floor. $50,000 transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands. Another $25,000 to something called a cryptocurrency exchange. Wire transfers to banks I couldn't pronounce, all dated within the last 6 months. All while I'd been clipping coupons and buying generic cereal to make our Social Security checks stretch. The phone rang at exactly 8:47 a.m. Harold's name flashed on the caller ID, and my heart hammered against my ribs as I answered. "Maggie?" His voice was tight, strained. Nothing like the casual tone from his goodbye the night before. "Listen, honey, I forgot my laptop at home. Don't touch it, okay? I'll deal with everything when I get back Sunday." I stared at the screen, at numbers that represented more money than I'd seen in my entire life. "Harold, what is all this?" The silence stretched so long, I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder. "We'll talk when I get home. Just don't do anything stupid, Maggie. You don't understand what you're looking at." The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone until the dial tone became unbearable, then set it down with hands that shook like autumn leaves. For the first time in 53 years of marriage, I realized I might not know my husband at all. Let me take you back to the beginning, to help you understand how I got to that moment. How a girl from Brooklyn who dreamed of becoming a teacher ended up as an invisible woman in a Queens row house, discovering her life was built on lies. I met Harold Kowalski at a USO dance in 1970. I was 19, working at Woolworth's in downtown Brooklyn, living with my parents in a cramped apartment above my father's shoe repair shop. Harold was 22, just back from his tour in Vietnam, broad-shouldered and serious in his dress blues. When he asked me to dance to "The Way You Look Tonight," I felt like Cinderella. He was different from the boys in my neighborhood. Quieter. More thoughtful. He talked about building something real, something lasting. He had plans, he said. dreams of owning his own business, of providing for a family. When he proposed 6 months later with a quarter-carat diamond he'd saved 3 months of army pay to buy, I said yes, without hesitation. We married in September 1971 at St. Stanislaus Church in Greenpoint. My dress was my mother's, taken in at the waist and shortened to hide the small tear in the hem. I carried white roses from my neighbor Mrs. Kowalowski's garden. Harold looked so handsome in his rented tuxedo, his dark hair slicked back, his smile wide and genuine. I thought I was the luckiest girl in Brooklyn. Our first apartment was a studio on the second floor of a brownstone in Jackson Heights. Harold found work at a small accounting firm in Manhattan, taking the subway every morning at 7:30 sharp. I kept my job at Woolworth's, adding my paycheck to his, saving every penny we could for our future. We'd spend evenings planning our dream house, sketching floor plans on napkins, talking about the children we'd have and the life we'd build together. For a while, it felt like a fairy tale. Sarah was born in 1973, a perfect baby with Harold's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. I quit work to care for her, and we moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in Elmhurst. Harold's accounting firm promoted him to senior bookkeeper, and for the first time, we could afford luxuries like a color television and a telephone in every room. Michael came along 2 years later, completing our little family. Harold started talking about buying a house, about putting down roots. He'd found a 3-bedroom ranch in Flushing, nothing fancy, but with a small backyard where the children could play. The down payment would wipe out our savings, but Harold was confident. His boss had hinted at making him a junior partner. Things were looking up. I should have noticed the changes then, the small shifts that would become chasms over the years. Harold grew more secretive about work, claiming client confidentiality when I asked about his day. He'd stay late at the office more frequently, coming home with whiskey on his breath and numbers scrawled on scraps of paper. When I expressed concern about our finances, he'd pat my head like I was one of the children. "Don't worry about such things, Maggie. That's what husbands are for." But I did worry. How could I not? I stretched every dollar, shopped sales, mended clothes until they fell apart. I grew vegetables in our tiny backyard, canned tomatoes and pickles, made soup from bones the butcher gave away free. Harold praised my frugality, called me his sensible wife, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel small, unnecessary. The children grew, and our expenses grew with them. School supplies, clothes, birthday parties, Christmas presents. I took in sewing to bring in extra money, staying up late hemming skirts and mending jackets by the light of our kitchen lamp. My fingers bled from needle pricks, my back ached from hunching over the sewing machine, but Harold barely seemed to notice. "You're so good with your hands, Maggie," he'd say, glancing up from his evening newspaper. Such a talented little seamstress. Little. He always used that word, like I was something small and cute and ultimately inconsequential. Sarah left for college in 1991, full scholarship to SUNY Purchase for art therapy. I was so proud, but Harold grumbled about the expense of textbooks and dorm supplies. Michael followed 2 years later, heading to Buffalo for engineering. The house felt enormous and empty with just Harold and me rattling around in it. That's when the arguments started. Real arguments. Not just Harold's dismissive grunts and my apologetic mumbles. I'd spent 20 years raising our children, building our home, supporting his career, and suddenly I was supposed to disappear into the wallpaper. Harold spent longer hours at work, joined a men's club, took up golf. I'd ask to join him sometimes, suggest we take up dancing or travel together now that the kids were gone. "You wouldn't enjoy it, Maggie. It's business talk. Boring stuff." Always business. Always something I wouldn't understand. I started volunteering at the local senior center, helping with their meal program. For a few hours each week, I felt useful again. Valuable. The elderly residents would light up when I walked in, ask about my week, compliment my blueberry muffins. Mrs. Chen would hold my hand and tell me stories about her childhood in Taiwan. Mr. Rodriguez taught me card games and called me his lucky charm. But at home, I was invisible again. Harold's accounting firm had grown, and he'd indeed become a partner, just as he'd predicted decades earlier. We had money now, not wealthy money, but comfortable money. Enough for Harold's golf memberships and business lunches and weekend trips. Enough for a new Buick every 3 years and restaurant dinners when I was too tired to cook. But I still clipped coupons, still bought generic brands, still mended clothes and stretched leftovers until they were unrecognizable. Old habits, Harold said. Waste not, want not. He'd pat my shoulder and peel off 20s for his golf games like he was dealing cards. The grandchildren started coming in the late 90s. Sarah had 2 daughters, Emma and little Grace, and Michael had a son, James. I lived for their visits, baking cookies and reading stories, playing dress-up and building blanket forts. In their eyes, I wasn't invisible. I was Grandma Maggie, the most important person in their world. Harold was different with them, too. Patient, playful. He'd get down on the floor to play blocks with James, push the girls on the swing set he'd installed in our backyard. For those brief moments, I'd catch glimpses of the young man who'd asked me to dance all those years ago. But when the children went home, the fog would roll back in. Harold behind his newspaper, me in front of the television, the silence between us as wide as the Grand Canyon. I started having chest pains in 2010, sharp, stabbing pains that would wake me from sleep and leave me gasping. Harold drove me to the emergency room twice, but the tests showed nothing definitive. Stress, the doctor said. Maybe some heartburn. Try to relax more. See? Harold said on the drive home. Always worrying about nothing. But the pains didn't stop. They got worse. I'd wake at 3 in the morning clutching my chest, certain I was having a heart attack. Harold would roll over and pull the pillow over his head, mumbling about my dramatics. I started keeping antacids on the nightstand, learned to muffle my gasps so I wouldn't wake him. Sarah noticed during one of her visits. "Mom, you look exhausted. Are you sleeping okay?" I wanted to tell her. Wanted to explain how lonely I felt lying next to her father every night. How the silence in our house had weight and substance. How I sometimes went entire days without speaking to another human being. But what would be the point? She had her own life, her own problems. Why burden her with mine? Just getting old, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about. The lies came so easily by then. Michael called less frequently, busy with his career and his family. When we did talk, the conversations were surface-level updates about the weather and the grandchildren. He'd ask about Harold's golf game and my volunteer work. But I could hear the distraction in his voice, the sound of him scrolling through emails or watching television. My 70th birthday came and went with a grocery store cake and cards from the grandchildren. Harold took me to dinner at Denny's. My choice, he said, though I'd never expressed any particular fondness for Denny's. The waitress sang happy birthday in a tired voice while Harold checked his phone. "This is nice," he said, cutting into his meatloaf. "Quiet. Just us. Just us. Like we were a romantic couple enjoying an intimate celebration instead of 2 strangers eating dinner in a fluorescent-lit restaurant." I started having dreams about my mother. She'd been dead for 15 years, but in my dreams, she was young again, standing in her kitchen in that floral house dress she always wore, flour in her dark hair from baking bread. She'd look at me with those knowing brown eyes and shake her head sadly. "Moja korka," she'd say, using the Polish endearment from my childhood. "My daughter, what happened to you?" I'd wake from these dreams with tears on my cheeks, a hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my phantom heart condition. The final straw should have been my 71st birthday. Harold forgot. Not just the celebration, he forgot the actual day. I woke to find him already dressed and heading out for an early golf game. I waited all morning for him to remember, making his favorite breakfast, wearing the dress he'd complimented years ago. When he came home that evening, whistling and relaxed from his day on the course, he kissed my forehead and asked what was for dinner. I served him pot roast and mashed potatoes in silence, waiting for the penny to drop. It never did. Sarah called that evening to wish me happy birthday, her voice bright and warm through the phone. "Did Dad take you somewhere special?" I looked across the living room at Harold, absorbed in his evening news program, and lied again. "Oh, you know your father. Very thoughtful." She laughed, that musical sound that had delighted me since she was a baby. "I love that you two are still so happy after all these years. It gives me hope for my own marriage." Happy. The word sat in my throat like a stone. But I kept going. Kept cooking and cleaning and pretending everything was fine. Kept volunteering at the senior center and listening to other women complain about their husbands' annoying habits while I smiled and nodded and said nothing about the growing emptiness inside me. Then came that October morning. The laptop. The bank accounts. The phone call that finally cracked open the shell I'd built around my heart. After Harold hung up, I sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours, scrolling through screens I didn't understand but somehow knew were important. Cryptocurrency investments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Offshore accounts in places I'd never heard of. Stock portfolios that would make us millionaires if they were legitimate. And they might have been legitimate. That was the cruelest part. Harold had always been good with numbers, good at finding opportunities. But he'd hidden it all from me. Every penny. Every investment. Every decision that should have been ours to make together. I printed everything. Pages and pages of bank statements and investment records and transaction histories. My printer, our printer, the one I'd used for years to print recipes and grandchildren's homework assignments, churned out evidence of a financial life I'd never been allowed to see. When Harold came home that Sunday evening, sunburned and smelling like beer and golf course grass, I was waiting for him at the kitchen table. The printed pages were stacked in neat piles, organized by account and date. I'd spent the weekend reading about cryptocurrency and offshore banking, educating myself about the money that should have been ours. He saw the papers and stopped dead in the doorway, his golf bag dropping to the linoleum floor with a heavy thud. "Maggie, I can explain." For the first time in 53 years of marriage, I cut him off. "Explain what, Harold? Explain how we have $2 million in investments that I've never seen? Explain why I've been buying generic cereal and clipping coupons while you play with cryptocurrency? Explain why you've let me worry about money for decades when we're actually wealthy?" He sat down across from me, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Surprise? Calculation. Something that might have been shame if I was being generous. "It's complicated, Maggie. These investments are risky. I didn't want to worry you if they went bad. But they didn't go bad, did they? They made us rich, and you never told me." He reached across the table like he was going to take my hand, but I pulled back. His fingers landed on the bank statements instead, and I watched him wince at the sight of our private business laid bare. "I was going to tell you, when the time was right, when everything was more stable." "When, Harold? When I was dead? When would the time have been right?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't take them back, couldn't take them back. They'd been building inside me for years, pressing against my ribs like caged birds. He tried everything then. Charm, which felt rusty and unfamiliar coming from him. Anger, which was more familiar but no longer frightening. Guilt, which had always been his most potent weapon. "I did this for us, Maggie, for our future, so you wouldn't have to worry." But I have worried. Every day for 50 years, I've worried about money, about having enough for emergencies, for the children, for retirement. You let me worry while you played millionaire in secret. The fight lasted until midnight. Harold alternated between defending his choices and trying to make me feel small for questioning them. But something had shifted in me during those 3 days alone with the truth. I'd felt the weight of being lied to, and I'd also felt the possibility of something different. When he finally went to bed, muttering about ungrateful wives and complicated financial matters, I stayed at the kitchen table. I looked at those papers, at the evidence of the life I should have been living, and made a decision that terrified me. I was going to stop being invisible. The next morning, I called Sarah. She was at work, but I could tell by her voice that she'd make time for me if I needed her to. That knowledge alone made me feel braver. "Mom, is everything okay? I need to ask you something, sweetheart. And I need you to be honest with me, even if it might hurt my feelings." A pause. Traffic sounds in the background. She was probably walking between buildings on her campus. "Of course, Mom. What's going on? Do you think I'm stupid?" "What?" "Mom, of course not. Why would you ask that? Your father has been making investment decisions for our family for years. Big decisions. Without telling me anything about them. He says it's because I wouldn't understand, because these things are too complicated for me." Another pause, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was careful, like she was feeling her way through a minefield. "Mom, you balanced the family checkbook for 30 years. You managed the household budget, figured out how to pay for college for 2 kids on Dad's salary, made every dollar stretch further than it should have been able to go. You're one of the smartest people I know when it comes to money." I started crying then, quietly. Tears dripping onto the bank statement spread across my kitchen table. Then why didn't he trust me? Why didn't he think I deserved to know about our own money? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, there was something new in her voice. Something harder. "I don't know, Mom, but I think you should talk to someone about this. Someone who isn't Dad." That afternoon, I went to the Queen's Public Library and used their computers to research divorce lawyers. The words divorce lawyer felt foreign and frightening on my fingers as I typed them into Google. At 71, I was researching how to leave my husband. The thought made me dizzy, but I made an appointment anyway. With Rebecca Chen, daughter of Mrs. Chen from the senior center, as it turned out. The world suddenly felt very small and interconnected. Rebecca's office was in a restored brownstone in Forest Hills, warm and welcoming with plants in every window and framed photos of her family on her desk. She was about Sarah's age, professionally dressed but with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I brought copies of Harold's financial records, my hands shaking as I spread them across her conference table. "Mrs. Kowalski, before we talk about anything else, I need to ask you a question. Are these accounts joint accounts? Is your name on them?" I looked at the papers, really looked at them for the first time, searching for my name. Margaret Kowalski. Mrs. Harold Kowalski. Any version of myself. I wasn't there. On any of them. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me understood perfectly. "We're married. Aren't I entitled to half of everything?" Rebecca's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught something in her eyes that looked like anger on my behalf. In New York, marriage doesn't automatically make you a joint owner of accounts your spouse opens individually. If your name isn't on these accounts, if you didn't sign for these investments, they legally belong to your husband alone. The room tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of the conference table and tried to breathe. But I'm his wife. Yes, you are. And if you choose to divorce, you'd be entitled to a portion of the marital assets. But Mrs. Kowalski, I need to ask you something difficult. When did your husband open these accounts? I looked at the dates on the statements. Some went back 15 years. Others were more recent. All of them opened and managed without my knowledge or consent. "I don't know," I whispered. "I never knew they existed." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice gentle but serious. "Mrs. Kowalski, what you're describing could be financial abuse. It's more common than people realize, especially in marriages where one spouse handles all the finances. The fact that your husband has hidden significant assets from you for years, while allowing you to worry about money and limit your spending, is concerning." Financial abuse. I'd never heard the term before, but it rang through me like a bell. All those years of clipping coupons while Harold had millions invested in cryptocurrency. All those nights lying awake worrying about emergency expenses while our offshore accounts earned interest. All those times I'd felt guilty for buying name-brand groceries while my husband played golf at clubs that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "What do I do?" I asked. "That depends on what you want, Mrs. Kowalski. Do you want to try to work this out with your husband? Do you want to separate? Do you want to file for divorce?" I stared at the financial records spread across her table. Numbers that represented decades of my life, of choices made without me, of a future planned around me but never including me. "I want him to see me," I said finally. "I want him to understand that I exist." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Let's start there then. Let's figure out how to make you visible again." I drove home that afternoon feeling like I was carrying explosives in my purse. The legal pad with Rebecca's notes felt heavy and dangerous. I had information now. Options. For the first time in decades, I had power. Harold was in the living room when I walked in, watching his evening news program like nothing had changed. Like we hadn't had the biggest fight of our marriage 3 days earlier. Like our entire relationship hadn't shifted on its axis. "Maggie, good, you're home. What's for dinner?" I stood in the doorway, still wearing my good coat, still carrying my purse with its explosive contents. "I saw a lawyer today." The words hung in the air like smoke. Harold's eyes didn't leave the television screen, but I saw his jaw tighten. "About what?" "About us. About our marriage. About what options I have when my husband has been hiding millions of dollars from me for years." He muted the television then and turned to look at me. Really look at me, maybe for the first time in years. "Maggie, don't be dramatic. I explained about the investments. I was protecting you." "From what? From wealth? From security? From having a say in my own financial future?" He stood up, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across his face that might have been panic. "You don't understand how these things work. The tax implications, the regulatory requirements. It's not simple like paying the electric bill." "Then explain it to me. Show me the accounts. Put my name on them. Make me a partner in my own marriage." We stared at each other across our living room, this space where we'd spent decades not really seeing each other. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, and I realized I wasn't going to break first. Not this time. "Fine," he said finally. "Fine, I'll show you everything. But not tonight. I need to organize the paperwork, make sure you understand the context." "When?" "This weekend, Saturday morning. I'll walk you through everything." I wanted to believe him. Part of me was already planning what questions I'd ask, what information I needed to feel comfortable with our finances again. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger since finding that laptop, whispered that this was just another delay, another way of making me wait for inclusion in my own life. "Okay," I said. "Saturday morning. But Harold, if you try to put me off again, if you try to hide anything else from me, I'm going to assume you never intend to treat me as an equal partner in this marriage." He nodded, but his eyes had already drifted back to the television screen. "Of course, Maggie. Saturday." Saturday came and went. Harold had an emergency at work, he said. A client crisis that couldn't wait. He'd promised to show me everything, walk me through our financial situation step by step. But suddenly there was paperwork missing and phone calls to return, and 1,000 reasons why we needed to postpone our conversation. "Next weekend," he said, kissing my forehead like I was a child being promised ice cream later. "I'll have everything organized by then." But I was done waiting, done accepting delays and excuses and postponements. I called Rebecca that Monday morning and scheduled another appointment. "I want to file for separation," I told her. "Not divorce, not yet. But I want a legal separation that gives me access to information about our marital assets." She nodded like she'd been expecting this call. "We can do that, Mrs. Kowalski. But I want to prepare you for what might happen. Your husband may fight this. He may try to convince you that you're making a mistake, that you're throwing away your marriage over money." "It's not about money," I said, and as the words came out, I realized how true they were. "It's about respect. It's about being seen as a person instead of a kept pet." The papers were served on a Tuesday afternoon while Harold was at his men's club. I wasn't home when the process server came, deliberately. I was at the senior center, helping Mrs. Rodriguez organize her medications, listening to Mr. Yamamoto tell stories about his grandchildren's baseball games. Being useful, being visible. Harold called my cell phone at 4:17 p.m., his voice tight with fury and disbelief. "What the hell is this, Maggie? Legal separation. Have you lost your mind?" I was in the senior center's kitchen, washing coffee cups and enjoying the way the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. The normalcy of the moment made Harold's anger feel distant and manageable. "I'm doing what I need to do to protect myself," I said calmly. "You've had weeks to show me our financial information. Instead, you've made excuses and postponed and treated me like I'm not smart enough to understand my own money." "Our money," he said. "It's our money, Maggie. I earned it for us." "Then why can't I see it? Why can't I have access to accounts that belong to both of us?" The line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. "Come home, Maggie. We'll talk about this properly. I'll show you everything, I promise." "You've promised before. This time is different. I understand now that I made mistakes. Come home and let's fix this." I dried the last coffee cup and hung up the dish towel, considering his words. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? For him to understand that his secrecy was wrong, that I deserved to be included in decisions about our future. This was him admitting fault, offering to change. So why did it feel like another manipulation? "I'll come home," I said finally, "but the separation stands until I see concrete changes. Not promises, changes." That evening, we sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd discovered his laptop just weeks earlier. Harold had spread out bank statements and investment portfolios, printouts of cryptocurrency wallets and offshore account balances. It looked like a paper explosion, overwhelming and impressive and probably designed to make me feel small. But I'd done my homework. During the weeks of Harold's excuses and delays, I'd been studying, reading about investments, researching cryptocurrency, learning about offshore banking. I wasn't the same ignorant woman who'd stumbled across his laptop by accident. "This account here," I said, pointing to a statement, "shows regular transfers to Bitcoin exchanges. But the amounts don't match what's showing up in the wallet balances. Where's the difference going?" Harold blinked at me like I'd started speaking Mandarin. "What do you mean?" "I mean there's money missing. You're transferring $50,000 a month to cryptocurrency exchanges, but the wallet balances only show about 60% of what should be there based on these transfers." I watched his face carefully, looking for tells. He was fidgeting with his pen, not meeting my eyes directly. These were signs I'd learned to read over decades of marriage, but I'd always interpreted them as stress about work. Now I wondered what else I'd missed. "Transaction fees," he said finally. "Bitcoin has high transaction fees, and the values fluctuate." "Harold." My voice was steady, patient. "I've been researching this for weeks. Transaction fees on Bitcoin are usually less than $5 per transaction. And value fluctuations would show up as gains and losses, not as money disappearing from accounts entirely." The silence stretched between us, filled with the hum of our refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Northern Boulevard. Harold stared at the papers spread across our table, and I could see him calculating, trying to decide how much truth he could afford to tell me. "There are other investments," he said finally. "More complicated ones. Some of the money goes there." "Show me." "They're not in my name, for tax purposes." "It's complicated, Maggie. Trust me on this. Trust him. The words that had kept me quiet and compliant for 53 years. Trust him to handle the money, to make the decisions, to know what was best for our family. Trust him while he hid millions of dollars and let me worry about grocery bills. No, I said quietly. I don't trust you on this. I don't trust you on anything anymore. Harold's face went red, the color creeping up his neck like spilled wine. After everything I've done for this family, after all the years I've provided for you and the children, this is the thanks I get? You don't trust me. You've been lying to me for decades, Harold. About money, about our future, about basic facts of our marriage. How can I trust you? He stood up abruptly, scattering papers across the floor. I never lied to you. I protected you from complicated financial decisions that would have given you panic attacks. You can barely handle balancing the checkbook without getting stressed out. The insult hit like a physical blow, but instead of making me cower the way it would have just weeks earlier, it made me angry, clearer, stronger. I've balanced our family checkbook for 30 years, Harold. I've managed to feed and clothe 4 people on your salary, put 2 children through college, and still save money for emergencies. I think I can handle knowing about our own bank accounts. That's different. That's just household budgeting. These are real investments, complex financial instruments. Then teach me. If you really want to include me, if you really want this marriage to work, then teach me what I need to know instead of treating me like I'm too stupid to learn. He stared at me across our kitchen, this man I'd shared my life with for more than half a century, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. It wasn't love or frustration or even anger. It was calculation, like he was trying to figure out how much he could get away with, how little he could reveal while still keeping me quiet. That's when I knew our marriage was over. Not legally. Not yet. But emotionally, spiritually, in all the ways that mattered, Harold had just showed me that he'd rather lose me than treat me as an equal. He'd rather end our relationship than share control of the money he'd made during our marriage. I bent down to pick up the scattered papers, gathering evidence of a financial life I'd been excluded from, and made my decision. I'm staying at Sarah's for a few days, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. When I come back, I want you to have made a choice. Either treat me as your wife and partner, with full access to information about our finances, or treat me as your adversary in a divorce proceeding. But I'm done being invisible in my own marriage. Harold didn't try to stop me as I packed a bag. Didn't apologize or promise to change or even ask when I'd be coming back. He sat in his recliner staring at the television while I gathered toiletries and a few changes of clothes. As I reached the front door, he called out, "You're making a mistake, Maggie. You're going to regret this." I paused with my hand on the doorknob, struck by how different those words sounded now than they would have a month ago. Then, they would have been a threat that would have sent me scurrying back to apologize. Now, they sounded like the desperate bluster of a man who'd finally been called on his behavior. "Maybe," I said, "but it's my mistake to make." Sarah's house in Glen Cove felt like a sanctuary. She'd converted the guest room into a little apartment for when her mother-in-law visited, with its own bathroom and a kitchenette. It was furnished simply but warmly, with a comfortable bed and reading chair, pictures of the grandchildren on the nightstand. "You can stay as long as you need to," Sarah said that first evening as we sat in her kitchen drinking tea. "But Mom, what's really going on? Yesterday you were talking about Dad hiding money. Now you're talking about separation. This feels like a lot of big changes very quickly." I told her everything then. About finding the laptop, about the millions of dollars in hidden accounts, about Harold's refusal to treat me as a partner in our own marriage. I told her about feeling invisible, about years of being dismissed and patronized, about the slowly growing realization that my husband didn't respect me as a person. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face cycling through expressions I couldn't read. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said finally. "I had no idea it was this bad. I knew Dad could be controlling sometimes, but I didn't realize he was hiding money from you. You couldn't have known. I didn't even know. What do you want to do now? It was a question I'd been asking myself for weeks. What did I want? For so long, my wants had been shaped around other people's needs. I wanted Harold to acknowledge my contributions to our marriage. I wanted my children to value my opinions. I wanted to feel necessary, important, seen. But sitting in Sarah's kitchen, finally speaking the truth about my marriage out loud, I realized those wants were all still about other people. They were all about earning respect and attention from people who'd shown me they weren't willing to give those things freely. I want to matter, I said. Not to anyone else, to myself. I want to wake up in the morning and know that my life has value even if no one else notices. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. Mom, your life has always had value. To me, to Michael, to your grandchildren. We love you. I know you do, sweetheart, but I need to love myself too, and I can't do that while I'm pretending that your father's behavior is acceptable. I stayed at Sarah's for 2 weeks. During the day, while she was at work and the girls were at school, I walked through their neighborhood, exploring streets I'd driven down hundreds of times but never really seen. I went to the library and read books I'd been meaning to get to for years. I volunteered at a different senior center, one where I was a new face with no history, and introduced myself as Margaret instead of Mrs. Kowalski. It was a small thing, that name change, but it felt revolutionary. Margaret. Not Harold's wife or Sarah's mother or the children's grandmother. Just Margaret, a 71-year-old woman who was figuring out who she wanted to be. Harold called every few days, his tone alternating between conciliatory and frustrated. He missed me, he said. The house felt empty. He was ready to talk about the money situation, really talk this time. Couldn't I just come home so they could work things out? But each conversation felt like a negotiation where he was trying to give me the minimum possible while still getting me back. He'd show me the account statements, but I didn't need access to actually make transactions. He'd explain his investment strategy, but I shouldn't worry about understanding all the details. He'd include me in future financial decisions, but I needed to trust his expertise. Always conditions, always limitations, always ways to keep me dependent on his goodwill for basic information about my own life. The breaking point came during our 3rd week of separation. Harold called on a Tuesday evening, his voice slurred with alcohol, angrier than I'd heard him in years. Do you have any idea what people are saying, Maggie? John Ferguson asked me about you at the club today. Everyone knows you've left me. Everyone is talking about our business. I was helping Emma with her math homework, sitting at Sarah's kitchen table with pencils and erasers scattered around us. The domestic normalcy of the moment made Harold's drunken fury feel even more distant and manageable. What people are saying isn't my responsibility, Harold. It is when you're embarrassing our family with this legal separation nonsense. Sarah's friends are asking her questions. Michael's concerned about the effect this is having on the grandchildren. I glanced at Emma, who was solving long division problems with serious concentration, completely unbothered by her grandfather's drama. The grandchildren were fine. They were resilient, adaptable, probably more aware of the tension in our marriage than the adults had given them credit for. Have you talked to Michael? I asked. Of course I've talked to him. He's as confused as I am about why you're throwing away 50 years of marriage over some paperwork. Some paperwork. Millions of dollars in hidden assets. Decades of financial deception. A lifetime of being treated as intellectually inferior. Reduced to some paperwork. Put him on the phone, Harold. What? If Michael is so concerned, if he has opinions about what I should be doing, then he can share them with me directly. Put him on the phone. There was a long pause, filled with the sound of Harold's labored breathing and what might have been the clink of ice in a glass. He's not here right now. Then have him call me. If my son wants to weigh in on my marriage, he can do it himself instead of sending messages through his father. I hung up before Harold could respond, my heart pounding with the audacity of what I'd just done. Emma looked up from her homework, her young face serious and thoughtful. "Grandma, are you okay?" "I'm getting there, sweetheart. How's that math coming along?" Michael called the next morning while I was having coffee on Sarah's back deck, watching cardinals at the bird feeder. His voice was careful, concerned, nothing like the anger Harold had described. "Mom, Dad's worried about you. We all are. This separation seems really sudden." "It's not sudden for me, Michael. I've been unhappy for a long time. I just finally decided to do something about it." "But Mom, marriage is work. All marriages have rough patches. Don't you think you should try counseling before making such a drastic decision?" I sipped my coffee and watched a cardinal crack sunflower seeds, struck by how different this conversation felt from my fights with Harold. Michael was worried, not angry. He wanted to understand, not control. "I've been trying to work on this marriage for decades, sweetheart. Your father has been hiding significant financial information from me for years. He's made major decisions about our future without consulting me. That's not a rough patch. That's a fundamental lack of respect." "I don't understand. Dad said this was about some investment accounts. Isn't that just his job? Managing the finances." There it was, the assumption that had supported Harold's behavior for decades. That managing our family finances was his job, his responsibility, his area of expertise. That I was just the beneficiary of his good decisions, not an equal partner who deserved input into choices that affected my own future. "Michael, your father and I have millions of dollars in investments that I've never seen. Money that was apparently earned during our marriage but hidden from me completely. While I was clipping coupons and worrying about having enough money for emergencies, he was playing with cryptocurrency and offshore banking. Can you understand why that might make me feel betrayed?" The line went quiet. When Michael spoke again, his voice was different. Smaller. "Millions?" "Millions. And you never knew?" "I never knew. I found out by accident when he left his laptop open. And when I confronted him about it, he said I wouldn't understand these complicated financial matters." Another long pause. I could picture Michael in his office in Buffalo, probably staring out the window at Lake Erie, trying to reconcile the father he knew with the man I was describing. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know it was that serious. Dad made it sound like you were upset about him not showing you the bank statements or something minor like that." "It's not minor to me. And it's not just about money. It's about being treated like a child instead of a partner. It's about 50 years of being told I'm too emotional or too simple to be included in important decisions. What do you want to happen? Do you want to divorce Dad?" It was the question I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. Divorce felt like failure, like giving up, like admitting that 5 decades of marriage had been a waste. But staying felt like accepting that I would never be seen as an equal partner in my own life. "I want your father to acknowledge that what he did was wrong, and to make concrete changes to include me in our financial life. If he's willing to do that, really do it, then we might be able to repair our marriage. If not, if not, if not, then I need to make decisions that protect my own future." We talked for another hour, and by the end of the conversation, Michael sounded more like the thoughtful man I'd raised and less like Harold's messenger. He promised to call his father, to encourage him to take my concerns seriously, to maybe even suggest marriage counseling. But I wasn't holding my breath. Harold had had weeks to show good faith, to demonstrate that he was willing to change. Instead, he'd made excuses, gotten angry, and tried to blame me for embarrassing him in front of his friends. That evening, Sarah and I were in her kitchen preparing dinner when her phone rang. Harold's name appeared on the caller ID, and she glanced at me questioningly. "Answer it," I said. "I'm curious what he has to say to you." She put the call on speaker, and Harold's voice filled the kitchen. Overly jovial in the way that meant he was trying to charm someone. "Sarah, sweetheart, how are you? How are my granddaughters?" "We're fine, Dad. How are you doing?" "Oh, you know, Lonely. The house is too quiet without your mother. I keep making dinner for two and then remembering she's not here. I rolled my eyes. Harold had barely noticed my presence during meals for years. Now suddenly he missed having me across the table from him? Dad, Mom told me about the investment accounts, about the money she didn't know about. The jovial tone dropped immediately. Your mother is upset about things she doesn't fully understand. I was protecting her from financial stress. Dad, she's not a child. She has a right to know about money that belongs to both of you. It's more complicated than that, Sarah. These investment vehicles require sophisticated understanding of market forces and regulatory environments. Your mother gets overwhelmed by complicated financial information. I gestured to Sarah to keep going, curious how far Harold would push this narrative with our daughter. Dad, Mom balanced our family budget for my entire childhood. She managed to save money for our college educations on your salary. She understands money just fine. That's different. That's just household management. This is real wealth, real financial complexity. I don't expect you to understand the difference. Sarah's face flushed red. As a social worker with a master's degree who managed budgets for nonprofit programs, she understood the condescension in Harold's dismissal perfectly. I don't expect you to understand the difference. The phrase hung in the air like a toxic cloud, revealing so much about Harold's attitude toward the women in his family. Dad? Sarah's voice was carefully controlled. I think you need to apologize to Mom and figure out how to include her in financial decisions. She's your wife, not your dependent. She's been my dependent for 50 years, Sarah. I've provided for her, given her a comfortable life, protected her from having to worry about money. Now she wants to throw all of that away because she's heard about some paperwork. Some paperwork again. Millions of dollars in hidden assets. Decades of deception. A fundamental betrayal of trust. All reduced to some paperwork. She wants to be treated with respect, Dad. She wants to be seen as your partner instead of your responsibility. I've always respected your mother. The words came out automatically, reflexively, like Harold had said them so many times he believed them himself. But sitting in Sarah's kitchen, listening to him dismiss both his wife and his daughter as too simple to understand financial complexity, the emptiness of that claim was obvious. Sarah looked at me, her eyebrows raised in a question. I nodded, and she took the phone off speaker, walking into the living room to finish the conversation privately. I could hear her voice rising and falling, occasionally sharp with frustration, but I couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. I'd heard enough to know that Harold hadn't changed, wasn't planning to change, and was now trying to use our children to pressure me into accepting his behavior. When Sarah came back to the kitchen, her face was tight with anger. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't realize how arrogant he could be. It's not your fault, sweetheart. You see what I've been dealing with. What are you going to do? I finished chopping vegetables for our salad, considering the question that seemed to follow me everywhere lately. What was I going to do? For the first time in my adult life, the answer was entirely up to me. I'm going to consult with my lawyer about filing for divorce. The words surprised me as I said them, but they felt right. True. Like stepping out of a costume I'd been wearing for 50 years and finally breathing freely. Sarah nodded slowly. I'll support whatever you decide, Mom. But I want you to know I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Proud of me. When had anyone last said they were proud of me? It was such a simple thing, but it hit me like sunlight after months of overcast skies. That night, lying in the comfortable guest bed, I called Rebecca Chen to schedule an appointment to discuss divorce proceedings. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. I felt hopeful about my future. The divorce papers were filed on a Thursday morning in November. Harold was served at his office, which felt appropriately symbolic, his professional world intersecting with the personal chaos he'd created. I wasn't there to see his reaction, but Rebecca said it was. intense. By Thursday evening, he was calling me every hour. Angry calls, pleading calls, confused calls where he seemed genuinely baffled that I was serious about ending our marriage. Between his calls, other people weighed in. His sister Catherine, who'd never liked me anyway, called to inform me that I was destroying the family over money. Harold's golf buddies' wives started treating me differently at church, their smiles strained and artificial. But other reactions surprised me. Mrs. Chen from the senior center patted my hand and told me how brave I was. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died 5 years earlier, confided that she envied my courage to choose my own path. Even Michael, after his initial shock, called to say he understood my decision. "I talked to Dad for 2 hours last night," he said. "He kept saying the same things over and over. How he provided for you, how he protected you, how ungrateful you were being. But Mom, he never once said he loved you. He never once said he was sorry for hiding things from you. It was all about what he'd done for you, never about what you needed from him." What I needed from him. Such a simple concept, but revolutionary in the context of our marriage. For 53 years, our relationship had been organized around what Harold needed from me, what the children needed from me, what our community expected from me. My needs had been an afterthought, if they were thought of at all. The legal process moved slowly, as legal processes do. There were depositions and asset valuations and negotiations about the division of property. Harold fought everything, challenged every valuation, questioned every expense. His lawyer painted me as a gold digger who was trying to take advantage of Harold's success, conveniently ignoring the fact that we'd been married for 5 decades, and I'd contributed to that success in countless unpaid ways. But Rebecca was thorough and patient, building a case that showed the pattern of financial deception and control that had characterized our marriage. She documented Harold's hidden accounts, his exclusion of me from major financial decisions, his systematic undermining of my confidence in money matters. During one particularly contentious deposition, Harold's lawyer asked me, "What did you contribute to the accumulation of these assets, Mrs. Kowalski? You didn't earn the money. You didn't make the investment decisions. What gives you the right to half of your husband's wealth?" I looked across the conference room at Harold, who was staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. For a moment, I saw him as the young soldier who'd asked me to dance 54 years earlier, and I felt a pang of grief for what we'd lost. But then I thought about all the years of invisibility, all the dismissals and condescensions and casual cruelties, and I found my voice. "I contributed my entire adult life," I said. "I raised our children while he worked late and traveled for business. I managed our household, maintained our social relationships, cared for his elderly parents until they died. I volunteered in our community, representing our family at school functions and church events and neighborhood gatherings. I provided the emotional labor that allowed him to focus on his career without worrying about the daily work of maintaining a family life." "But that's just what wives do," Harold's lawyer said. "That's the traditional division of labor in marriage." "Exactly," I said. "And traditionally, that unpaid labor is considered contribution to the marriage. I'm not asking for something I haven't earned. I'm asking for recognition of what I've already given." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Rebecca leaned forward and said, "I think we're done here." By spring, the divorce was final. Harold received the majority of the assets, which was fine with me. I wasn't interested in being wealthy. I was interested in being free. My settlement included the house, which I immediately sold, enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and access to health insurance and Social Security benefits. More importantly, it included my name on my own bank accounts, my own credit cards, my own financial future. For the first time since I was 19 years old, I was financially independent. I bought a small condo in Flushing Meadows, walking distance from the subway and close enough to Sarah's family for regular visits, but far enough away to maintain my independence. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and a tiny balcony overlooking a community garden. After decades in Harold's suburban ranch, it felt like a palace. The day I moved in, Emma and Grace helped me unpack boxes while Sarah assembled my new furniture. We ate Chinese takeout on the floor of my living room, using paper plates and plastic forks, and I felt more at home than I had in years. "This is nice, Grandma," Emma said, looking around at my still empty walls and scattered belongings. "It feels like you. Like me." I wasn't sure what that meant anymore, but I was excited to find out. That summer, for the first time in my life, I traveled alone. Not a business trip or a family vacation or a visit to relatives, but a real trip, planned by me for my own enjoyment. I took a bus tour of New England, visiting small towns and historical sites, staying in bed and breakfasts, and meeting other travelers. In Vermont, I met Dorothy, a widow from Ohio, who was on her own adventure after her husband's death 2 years earlier. We bonded over shared experiences of marriage to controlling men and the strange liberation of suddenly being responsible for our own decisions. "The hardest part," Dorothy said as we sat on the porch of our inn in Stowe, watching the sunset over the mountains, "wasn't learning to be alone. It was learning to trust my own judgment after decades of being told it wasn't reliable." I knew exactly what she meant. Every decision felt momentous when you weren't used to making them. What to eat for breakfast, what route to take to the store, how to spend a free afternoon. Choices that seemed trivial became overwhelming when you'd never been allowed to make them freely. But gradually, decision by decision, day by day, I was remembering who I was underneath 50 years of being Harold's wife. I liked spicy food, which Harold had always said was too hard on his stomach. I enjoyed jazz music, which he'd dismissed as noise. I was interested in politics and current events, subjects he'd claimed were too depressing for dinner conversation. I started taking classes at the local community college. Art history first, then basic computer skills, then creative writing. My classmates were mostly people my age or older, returning students and lifelong learners who welcomed my questions and valued my perspectives. For the first time in decades, I felt intellectually stimulated, challenged in ways that made me excited about learning new things. My creative writing instructor, a woman about Sarah's age named Jennifer, encouraged me to write about my experiences with marriage and divorce. The first essay I turned in was tentative, apologetic, full of qualifications and disclaimers. Jennifer handed it back with a note. "Stop apologizing for your truth. Own your story. Own my story." Such simple advice, but it changed the way I thought about my life. This wasn't a tragedy or a failure or something to be ashamed of. This was my story, my journey from invisibility to visibility, from dependence to independence. It was worth telling. Michael visited in the fall, bringing his family for a long weekend. He'd been hesitant about the divorce initially, worried about taking sides, but seeing me in my new environment seemed to shift his perspective. "You seem different, Mom," he said as we walked through the community garden behind my building. "Happier. More. Present." "I feel more present," I said. "For the first time in decades, I'm living my own life instead of just supporting everyone else's." "Do you miss Dad at all?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times over the past year. Did I miss Harold? Did I regret ending our marriage? "I miss the idea of him," I said finally. "I miss the dream of what we could have been together if he'd been able to see me as an equal partner. But I don't miss the reality of feeling invisible in my own home." "For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. He's been dating someone from his golf club. She's about your age but treats him like he's some kind of financial genius. It's uncomfortable to watch." Dating someone new. Of course he was. Harold had never been comfortable being alone, had never developed the self-reliance that came from making your own decisions and living with the consequences. He needed someone to take care of, someone to impress with his wealth and worldly knowledge. I felt a moment of sympathy for his new girlfriend, whoever she was. But mostly, I felt grateful that it wasn't me anymore. Christmas that year was different, but not sad. Sarah invited me to spend the holidays with her family, and for the first time, I didn't have to coordinate my plans around Harold's schedule or preferences. I could stay as long as I wanted, leave when I was ready, participate in decisions about meals and activities and gift-giving. On Christmas morning, as I watched Emma and Grace tear through their presents with the unself-conscious glee of children who felt completely loved, I realized something profound. I was happy. Not content or resigned or making the best of a bad situation. Actually, genuinely happy. It had been so long since I'd felt that way that I'd forgotten what it was like. The lightness in my chest, the sense of possibility about the future, the feeling that each day held potential for small discoveries and quiet joys. That winter, I started volunteering at a literacy program for adult learners. Many of my students were immigrants working to improve their English. Others were Americans who'd fallen through the cracks of the education system. All of them were hungry to learn, grateful for patient instruction, respectful of the knowledge I could share. One of my students, Maria, reminded me a little of myself at 19, young, hopeful, but constrained by circumstances beyond her control. She was trying to improve her English so she could qualify for better jobs, working toward independence from a husband who controlled their finances and dismissed her ambitions. "My husband says I don't need career," she told me during one of our sessions. "He says he provides, I should be happy." "What do you think?" I asked. She looked surprised by the question, like no one had ever asked for her opinion before. I think I want more. I want to feel proud of myself, not just grateful for someone else. I wanted to feel proud of myself, not just grateful for someone else. Maria had articulated something I'd been struggling to express for months. Gratitude was fine. Gratitude for Harold's provision, for my children's love, for the comfort of our middle-class life. But gratitude alone wasn't enough. I wanted to earn my own pride, to build something with my own hands and mind and heart. Through the literacy program, I met other volunteers who became friends. Patricia, a retired teacher who shared my love of historical fiction. David, a former social worker who was passionate about community organizing. Susan, a widow like Dorothy who'd discovered painting after her husband's death and was now selling her work at local art fairs. These friendships were different from the relationships I'd had during my marriage. They weren't built around our husbands' careers or our children's activities or shared obligations. They were based on common interests, mutual respect, and genuine affection. No one needed anything from me except my company and perspective. For my 73rd birthday, Sarah threw me a small party at my condo. Just family and my new friends, nothing elaborate, but it felt more meaningful than decades of dinner celebrations with Harold. People brought dishes to share, books they'd enjoyed, small gifts they'd chosen specifically for me. Patricia gave me a journal with Margaret's stories embossed on the cover. "For when you're ready to write the whole thing down," she said with a knowing smile. That night, after everyone had gone home and I was cleaning up paper plates and wine glasses, I sat on my balcony and opened the journal. The first page was blank, waiting for whatever I wanted to say. I wrote, "I still remember the weight of that day crushing me like a wave I never saw coming." And then I kept writing. About finding Harold's laptop, about years of feeling invisible, about the slow process of learning to trust my own judgment, about divorce and independence and the strange relief of being responsible only for my own happiness. Writing my story felt like taking ownership of it in a way I'd never done before. All these years, I'd thought of my life as something that happened to me. Marriage, motherhood, middle age, all of it flowing around me like water around a stone. But putting it down on paper, I could see the choices I'd made, the moments when I could have acted differently, the gradual evolution from passive victim to active participant in my own life. The hardest part wasn't writing about Harold's betrayal or the loneliness of our marriage. The hardest part was writing about my own complicity, my own willingness to accept invisibility in exchange for security. I'd been an adult woman making adult choices, even when those choices were to remain silent and compliant. Owning that responsibility was painful, but also liberating. Spring came early that year. By March, the community garden was full of neighbors preparing flower beds and vegetable plots. I'd never had my own garden before. Harold had hired a landscaping service to maintain our suburban yard, but I rented a small plot and started researching what vegetables grew well in Queens. Mrs. Liu, an elderly Chinese woman whose plot bordered mine, became my informal gardening mentor. She spoke limited English, but we communicated through gestures and shared work, planting seeds and watering seedlings side by side in comfortable companionship. "Garden is patience," she told me one afternoon as we transplanted tomato seedlings. "Plant, water, wait, no hurry. Plant, water, wait, no hurry." It struck me as good advice for more than gardening. After decades of feeling like I was falling behind, like everyone else had figured out secrets I'd somehow missed, the idea of moving at my own pace felt revolutionary. My vegetables grew slowly but steadily through the spring and summer. Cherry tomatoes, bell peppers, herbs for cooking, flowers for beauty. Nothing spectacular, but all of it mine. Planted by my hands, tended with my care, grown according to my choices about what I wanted in my small corner of the world. Harold called in July, ostensibly to discuss some final paperwork related to our divorce settlement, but really to tell me about his engagement to the woman from the golf club. Her name was Patricia, not to be confused with my friend Patricia, and she was 68, a widow with grown children who apparently appreciated Harold's financial acumen and take-charge approach to life. "I thought you should hear it from me," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "before someone else mentioned it to you." I was tending my tomato plants when he called. Soil under my fingernails, sweat on my forehead from working in the afternoon sun. The absurdity of discussing Harold's new engagement while I was literally growing my own food struck me as almost comically appropriate. "Congratulations," I said, and meant it. "I hope you'll be happy together." There was a long pause, like he was expecting me to be angry or hurt or jealous. When I didn't provide the drama he might have been anticipating, he seemed confused about how to proceed. "She understands the importance of traditional marriage roles," he said finally. "She appreciates being taken care of." "I'm sure she does. Some people do." "Don't you think that's what marriage should be? A man providing for his wife, protecting her from the complexities of the world?" I looked across my garden at Mrs. Liu, who was harvesting vegetables for her dinner, a woman who'd raised 6 children, survived wars and famines, immigrated to a foreign country, and built a life with her own hands. The idea that women needed protection from complexity seemed almost laughably naive. "I think marriage should be whatever the people in it decide it should be," I said. "If that works for you and Patricia, then I'm genuinely happy for you both." And I was. Not because I wanted Harold to be happy, though I didn't wish him ill, but because his engagement meant he was truly moving on with his life. I was no longer his responsibility to manage or worry about. I was completely, finally, definitively free to be my own person. That evening, I celebrated my freedom by cooking dinner with vegetables from my garden and eating on my balcony while reading a mystery novel. No one to consider except myself. No one's preferences to accommodate except my own. Just Margaret, enjoying her own company on a beautiful summer evening. Fall brought new challenges and opportunities. Jennifer, my creative writing instructor, suggested I submit some of my essays to magazines and online publications. The idea terrified me. Who was I to think strangers would want to read about my experiences? But I'd been practicing courage for 2 years now, making choices that scared me because they led toward growth. My first published essay appeared in a magazine for women over 50. a piece about learning to trust your own judgment after decades of deferring to others. The editor liked my voice, she said, authentic and relatable without being bitter or self-pitying. Seeing my name in print, Margaret Kowalski, not Mrs. Harold Kowalski, felt like the culmination of my journey from invisibility to visibility. Someone had found my thoughts worth sharing, my experiences worth reading about. I existed as an individual, separate from my relationships to other people. The essay generated responses from women all over the country who'd had similar experiences with controlling marriages and late-in-life liberation. Their letters and emails filled me with gratitude and purpose. Maybe my story could help other women recognize their own worth, trust their own judgment, make their own brave choices. I started working on a longer piece, something that would capture the full journey from discovery to divorce to rebuilding. A memoir, Jennifer suggested. A book-length exploration of what it means to become visible to yourself after decades of invisibility. Writing a book felt impossibly ambitious, but I'd learned to start with small steps and trust the process. One page at a time, one chapter at a time, one story at a time. Plant, water, wait. No hurry. Winter settled over Queens with unusual gentleness that year. Instead of the harsh cold and bitter winds I remembered from previous years, we had moderate temperatures and just enough snow to make the world beautiful without making it treacherous. Maybe the weather was exactly the same as always, and I was just experiencing it differently as someone who had time to notice beauty instead of just surviving from one obligation to the next. My 74th birthday in January was a quiet celebration with my chosen family, Sarah and her daughters, my friends from the literacy program and writing class, Mrs. Liu from the garden. We gathered in my living room for homemade soup and birthday cake, sharing stories and laughter and the kind of comfortable fellowship that comes from people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Michael called to wish me happy birthday, and I could hear in his voice that he was still adjusting to his parents' divorce and his father's remarriage. It was harder for adult children, I thought, when their parents' marriage ended. They'd built their understanding of family around the stability of that relationship, and its dissolution forced them to reassess what they'd thought they knew about love and commitment. "Are you really okay, Mom?" he asked. "I mean, really okay? Sometimes I worry that you're just putting on a brave face." It was a fair concern. I'd spent so many years putting on brave faces, pretending to be fine when I wasn't, that even my children might struggle to recognize genuine contentment when they saw it. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart. I'm happy. Not happy like everything is perfect, but happy like I'm living a life that feels authentic to who I actually am." "And you don't regret the divorce? You don't miss the security of being married?" "I miss some things about being married. I miss having someone to share daily experiences with, someone who knows my history and remembers the same events. But I don't miss feeling like I didn't matter, like my thoughts and feelings were less important than everyone else's. The security wasn't worth the price I was paying for it." We talked for another hour, and by the end of our conversation, Michael sounded more at peace with my choices. He was beginning to understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint people who've grown accustomed to your compliance. Spring came again, my third spring as a divorced woman, and with it came new possibilities. The literacy program asked me to help develop a curriculum for older adult learners, drawing on my experience as both teacher and student. A local historical society invited me to give talks about women's experiences in post-war America, using my own story as a jumping-off point for broader discussions about gender roles and social change. My memoir was taking shape, chapter by chapter, story by story. Reading it back, I was struck by how much my voice had changed over the course of writing it. The early chapters were tentative, apologetic, full of qualifications and self-doubt. The later chapters were stronger, more confident, clearer about what I'd learned and what I wanted readers to understand. That's what healing looks like, I realized. Not a sudden transformation from victim to victor, but a gradual strengthening, like a plant putting down deeper roots and growing toward the light. I was the same person who'd discovered Harold's laptop 3 years earlier, but I was also completely different. Same history, same memories, same fundamental personality, but with a completely different understanding of my own value and agency. The garden taught me patience again that spring. Some of my seeds failed to germinate, victims of late frost or poor soil or simple bad luck. Others grew more slowly than I'd hoped, requiring more water or fertilizer or care than I'd anticipated. But some exceeded my expectations, producing more fruit or flowers than I'd dared to hope for. Life was like that too, I was learning. Some efforts failed despite your best intentions. Some dreams took longer to realize than you'd planned. But some possibilities that seemed impossible turned out to be not just achievable, but sustainable. Mrs. Liu and I worked side by side through the growing season, our friendship deepening despite our language barriers. She taught me to preserve vegetables through pickling and fermentation. I helped her write letters to her grandchildren in English. We shared meals and stories, comparing our experiences of marriage and widowhood and independence. One afternoon, as we harvested late summer tomatoes, she looked at me with serious eyes and said, "You brave woman. Leave husband, start new life. Very brave." "Not brave," I said. "Just tired of being invisible." She nodded thoughtfully, then said, "Same thing. Brave is when tired of being invisible. Brave is when tired of being invisible." I wrote that in my journal that night, struck by the truth of it. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the presence of something stronger than fear. For me, that something had been exhaustion with my own invisibility, with living a life that felt like a shadow of what was possible. Fall brought unexpected news. Harold had a heart attack in September. Not fatal, but serious enough to require surgery and lifestyle changes. Sarah called to tell me, unsure whether I'd want to know or how I might react. My first emotion was genuine concern. Whatever our marriage had become, Harold and I had shared 53 years of life together. We'd raised children, buried parents, weathered crises, and celebrated milestones. I didn't want him to suffer or die. Didn't want our children and grandchildren to lose their father and grandfather. My second emotion was relief that I wasn't responsible for managing his care, for becoming his caregiver, for organizing my life around his recovery. 3 years earlier, I would have rushed to the hospital, canceled my plans, dedicated myself to nursing him back to health. Now, I could offer emotional support to our children while maintaining the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. I sent flowers to the hospital with a simple note, "Wishing you a full and speedy recovery." Nothing more, nothing less. Appropriate concern from the mother of his children without overstepping the boundaries of our new relationship as ex-spouses. Harold called when he got home from the hospital, ostensibly to thank me for the flowers, but really I suspected, because his brush with mortality had made him want to reconnect with his past. His voice was weak but warm, more genuinely affectionate than I'd heard in years. "Maggie, thank you for the flowers. That was kind of you. I was sorry to hear about your heart attack. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck, but grateful to be alive. It makes you think, you know, about what's important." I waited, curious where this conversation was heading but not willing to guess or fill the silence with reassurances. "I've been thinking about us," he continued, "about our marriage, about the way things ended." "Oh? I know I wasn't the husband you needed me to be. I know I made mistakes with the money situation, keeping things from you. I was trying to protect you, but I see now that you didn't experience it as protection." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from Harold, and part of me appreciated the acknowledgement. But another part of me, the part that had learned to trust my own instincts, wondered if this was just another manipulation, another attempt to rewrite history in a way that made him feel better about his choices. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "I hope your recovery goes well." Maggie. His voice was urgent now, like he could sense me preparing to end the conversation. Do you ever think about what might have been different? If I'd handled things better from the beginning? Do I ever think about what might have been different? Of course I did. I thought about it every time I made my own financial decisions. Every time I chose how to spend my time without consulting anyone. Every time I felt the simple joy of being seen and valued for myself. But I'd learned the difference between thinking about alternate possibilities and wanting to recreate them. Harold's heart attack hadn't transformed him into a different person any more than my divorce had transformed me. We were who we'd always been, just with a clearer understanding of what we wanted from life. I think about it sometimes, I said honestly. But Harold, we can't change the past. We can only decide what to do with the future we actually have. Would you consider having coffee sometime, just to talk? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with history and possibility and danger. Having coffee seemed harmless enough, but I'd learned to be suspicious of my own desire to accommodate other people's needs at the expense of my own well-being. I don't think that would be good for either of us, I said gently. We've both moved on with our lives. I think we should honor that. There was a long silence, and when Harold spoke again, his voice was sad but accepting. I understand. Take care of yourself, Maggie. You too, Harold. I genuinely hope you'll be happy. After I hung up, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, processing the conversation and my own reactions to it. 3 years ago, Harold's vulnerability and apparent remorse would have pulled me back into old patterns of caregiving and forgiveness. I would have rushed to comfort him, to rebuild bridges, to try once again to make our relationship work. But I'd learned something important about forgiveness during my journey toward independence. Forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. I could forgive Harold for the years of invisibility and control without returning to a relationship that had been fundamentally damaging to my sense of self. I could wish him well without sacrificing my own well-being on the altar of his needs. The conversation left me feeling sad, but also proud of myself for maintaining boundaries that protected the life I'd built. This was what emotional maturity looked like, being able to offer genuine compassion without losing yourself in the process. Winter that year was harsher than the previous one, with bitter cold and heavy snow that kept me indoors for days at a time. But my apartment felt cozy rather than confining, filled with books and plants and creative projects that made solitude feel rich rather than lonely. I was making progress on my memoir, working with Jennifer to refine my voice and structure my experiences into a coherent narrative. The process of writing had become a form of meditation, a way of understanding not just what had happened to me, but what it meant, how it had changed me, what lessons it might offer to other women in similar situations. One chapter in particular gave me trouble, the section about my children's reactions to the divorce. I wanted to be honest about their initial resistance and confusion without betraying their privacy or making them seem unsympathetic. They'd been caught between loyalty to their father and recognition of my legitimate grievances, a position that requires both children and grandchildren to navigate with grace and maturity. Write them as full human beings, Jennifer suggested during one of our editing sessions. Show their complexity, their growth, their own journey toward understanding. Readers will respect that more than if you try to protect them by making them seem perfect. She was right, of course. My children weren't characters in my story. They were people with their own stories, their own struggles with family loyalty and changing dynamics. Treating them as complex human beings rather than simple supporters or opponents made for a richer, more honest narrative. Spring returned with its usual promise of renewal and growth. My third spring as a divorced woman, my fourth spring in the condo, my second spring working on the memoir that would eventually become the book you're listening to now. The garden was easier this year, my third season of planting and tending and learning what thrived in my small plot. I knew which varieties of tomatoes did best in the soil conditions, which herbs would spread aggressively and needed to be contained, which flowers would attract butterflies, and which would keep pests away. Experience was a teacher I'd come to value, especially after so many years of feeling like I was stumbling through life without guidance or confidence. Now I could see the accumulation of knowledge and skill, the way each season built on the previous one to create something more beautiful and productive than what had come before. Mrs. Liu brought her great-grandson to visit the garden that spring, a toddler who squealed with delight at the earthworms we uncovered while weeding and tried to eat handfuls of soil before his great-grandmother redirected him toward more appropriate garden snacks. "He learn early," she told me as we watched him toddle between the rows of plants. "Garden teach patience, work, waiting for good things. Garden teach patience, work, waiting for good things." I thought about that phrase often in the following weeks, struck by how applicable it was to everything I'd learned about rebuilding life after loss. The end of my marriage had felt like a devastation, like the destruction of everything I'd worked to build. But it had also been a planting season, an opportunity to put down new roots and grow toward different light. My 75th birthday approached with a significance I hadn't expected. 75 felt like a milestone, a marker of real longevity and accumulated wisdom. I'd lived 3/4 of a century, survived depression and war and social upheaval, raised children and buried parents, and navigated the transformation from traditional housewife to independent woman. Sarah suggested we celebrate with a family gathering, but I found myself wanting something different. Instead of a party focused on my relationships to other people, I wanted to celebrate my relationship with myself, the woman I'd become through years of patient work and brave choices. I planned a day that was entirely about my own preferences and interests. A morning at the Metropolitan Museum, looking at paintings I'd always meant to see. Lunch at a restaurant I'd been curious about, but had never suggested during the years when Harold dismissed any cuisine more adventurous than Italian-American. An afternoon in Central Park, reading under a tree like I'd done as a young woman when the world still felt full of unlimited possibilities. The day was perfect in its ordinariness, in its complete alignment with what I actually wanted rather than what I thought I should want or what other people expected from me. Sitting under that tree in Central Park, reading a novel I'd chosen because the cover intrigued me, and eating an ice cream cone because I felt like it, I experienced a moment of pure contentment that felt like coming home to myself. That evening, alone in my apartment with takeout Chinese food and a glass of wine, I called my children to thank them for their birthday wishes and to share something I'd been thinking about all day. "I want you both to know," I told them, "that I'm grateful for the way you've supported my choices over the past few years. I know it wasn't easy, watching your parents' marriage end, adjusting to new family dynamics. But you've both grown into adults who can hold complexity, who can love people without endorsing all their choices, who can navigate change with grace. I'm proud of you." Sarah cried a little, and Michael was quiet for a long moment before saying, "We learned that from you, Mom. The grace and the complexity and the ability to change. We learned that from watching you rebuild your life. We learned that from watching you rebuild your life." I'd seen my divorce as something that happened to my children, something they had to endure and adapt to. I hadn't considered that they might also see it as a model of resilience, proof that it's never too late to make brave choices and start over. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Today I am 75 years old. I have been divorced for 4 years, independent for 4 years, visible to myself for 4 years. I am happier now than I have ever been, not because my life is perfect, but because it is authentically mine." Summer brought news that my memoir had found a publisher, a small press that specialized in women's stories and social justice narratives. Reading the acceptance letter, I felt the same mixture of pride and disbelief I'd experienced when I saw my first essay in print. Someone thought my story was worth sharing with the world, worth turning into a book that might help other women recognize their own worth and possibilities. The editing process was intensive but exciting, working with professionals who understood the importance of authentic voice and honest storytelling. They asked hard questions about motivation and consequence, pushed me to dig deeper into the emotional truth of my experiences, helped me craft a narrative that was both personal and universal. "Your story arc is powerful," my editor told me during one of our phone calls. "You move from victimhood to agency without making it seem easy or inevitable. Readers will recognize themselves in your struggles and find hope in your transformation." The book was scheduled for publication the following spring. Time to reach bookstores just as I turned 76. The symmetry felt appropriate. A life story released into the world as I entered what many people consider the final quarter of life, but what I was beginning to think of as a new beginning. That fall, Harold married his Patricia in a small ceremony at their golf club. I heard about it through Sarah, who'd been invited but had chosen not to attend, not wanting to navigate the emotional complexity of celebrating her father's new marriage while still processing her parents' divorce. I felt no jealousy about Harold's remarriage, only a distant curiosity about what his new wife saw in him and whether she understood what she was signing up for. Part of me wanted to warn her about his tendency to make unilateral decisions and his need to control financial information, but I recognized that impulse as both presumptuous and unhelpful. She was an adult woman making her own choices, just as I had been, just as I now was. Instead, I sent Harold a wedding card with a simple message: "Wishing you both happiness in your new marriage." And I meant it. His happiness or unhappiness was no longer my responsibility, but I didn't wish him ill. We'd shared too much history, created too much together, for me to want him to suffer. The card was the last direct communication we'd have, I suspected. With his remarriage and my growing independence, there was no longer any reason for our paths to cross except through our children and grandchildren. We were becoming what divorced couples should become: part of each other's history, but not each other's future. Winter settled over New York with unusual beauty that year, with snow that transformed the city into something magical, and temperatures cold enough to make indoor warmth feel precious. I spent long evenings working on final revisions to the book, crafting sentences that would capture not just what had happened, but what it had felt like, what it had meant, what it might teach. One chapter that had been particularly difficult to write was about forgiveness. Not forgiving Harold, but forgiving myself for all the years I'd accepted invisibility. For all the times I'd chosen compliance over self-respect, for all the ways I'd participated in my own diminishment. Self-forgiveness, I was learning, was harder than forgiving others, because it required taking responsibility for choices I'd made, while also extending compassion for the circumstances that had shaped those choices. "I forgive myself for not knowing what I hadn't been taught," I wrote. "I forgive myself for not having courage I hadn't yet developed. I forgive myself for accepting the limitations others placed on me before I learned to recognize my own worth." The process of writing that chapter was emotionally exhausting, but ultimately liberating. Self-forgiveness, I discovered, wasn't about excusing poor choices or denying responsibility for consequences. It was about extending the same compassion to yourself that you would offer to a friend facing similar circumstances. Spring arrived early that year, with crocuses blooming in February and trees budding weeks ahead of schedule. The early warmth felt like a gift, an invitation to spend more time outdoors, to start the garden season with unusual optimism and energy. Mrs. Lou and I began preparing our plots for another growing season, discussing what we wanted to plant, what had worked well the previous year, what we wanted to try differently. Our friendship had deepened over the winters we'd known each other, built on shared work and mutual respect, rather than common language or cultural background. "Every year different," she told me as we turned soil and added compost. "Same garden, but different plants, different weather, different results. Like life. Same garden, but different plants, different weather, different results. Like life." I was struck by the wisdom in her observation, the way it captured both continuity and change, predictability and surprise. I was the same person who'd discovered Harold's laptop 5 years earlier. But I was also completely different. Same history, same fundamental personality, but with completely different circumstances, relationships, and understanding of my own capabilities. Same garden, different plants, different results. The book was published in April, released into the world with modest marketing budget, but enthusiastic support from my publisher and editor. Holding the first copy, seeing my name on the cover, was a moment I'd dreamed about, but never quite believed would happen. From invisible to visible, a woman's journey from marriage to independence looked official and important in my hands. Proof that my experiences mattered enough to warrant publication, that my story might help other women recognize their own worth and possibilities. The book received positive reviews in publications aimed at older women, and I was invited to speak at libraries and community centers about my experiences with late-in-life divorce and independence. Public speaking had never been comfortable for me, but I'd learned to do things that scared me when they aligned with my values and goals. My first book talk was at the Queen's Public Library, the same system where I'd researched divorce lawyers years earlier. The audience was mostly women in their 60s and 70s, many of whom nodded in recognition as I described the gradual erosion of voice and agency that could happen in long-term marriages. During the question and answer session, a woman about my age raised her hand and asked, "Do you ever regret getting divorced? Do you miss being married?" It was a question I'd heard variations of many times, and I'd developed an honest answer that acknowledged both loss and gain. "I miss some things about being married," I said. "I miss having someone to share daily experiences with, someone who remembers the same history, someone to call when something interesting or funny happens. But I don't miss feeling invisible in my own life. I don't miss having my judgment questioned or my capabilities underestimated. I don't miss organizing my entire existence around someone else's preferences and schedules." Another woman asked, "What advice would you give to women who are in similar situations but are afraid to leave?" "Start small," I said. "You don't have to file for divorce tomorrow, but start noticing when you feel invisible, when your opinions are dismissed, when you're making yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's need to feel bigger. Start trusting your own perceptions and building confidence in your own judgment. The big decisions become possible when you've practiced making smaller ones." After the event, several women approached me individually to share their own stories, their own struggles with invisibility and control. Some were still married, trying to change dynamics that had been established for decades. Others were recently divorced, navigating the challenges of rebuilding life after long relationships. All of them were hungry for connection with someone who understood their experiences from the inside. Those conversations were the most rewarding part of the book tour. The moments when I could see that my story had given other women permission to value their own experiences, to trust their own perceptions, to consider possibilities they might not have imagined before. Summer passed in a blur of speaking engagements and garden work, of writing and reading, and the simple pleasures of living according to my own rhythms and preferences. My book was selling steadily, not a bestseller, but reaching the audience it was meant for. Women who needed to hear that it's never too late to choose visibility over invisibility, agency over compliance. One evening in late August, as I was watering my tomato plants in the golden light before sunset, I realized that I could no longer remember what it felt like to wake up dreading the day ahead. For so many years, I'd opened my eyes each morning to a sense of heaviness, of obligations and expectations that felt overwhelming or impossible to meet. Now my days felt manageable, even exciting, filled with choices I got to make rather than responsibilities imposed by others. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken years of small decisions, tiny acts of courage, gradual building of confidence in my own judgment. But somewhere along the way, dread had been replaced by curiosity, obligation had been replaced by opportunity, heaviness had been replaced by lightness. That night, I called Sarah to share my realization, to try to put words to the profound shift in how I experience daily life. "I think that's what healing looks like," she said. Not a sudden change, but a gradual replacement of old patterns with new ones, old feelings with new ones. You've rebuilt your relationship with your own life. Rebuilt my relationship with my own life. That phrase stayed with me for days, capturing something essential about what had happened during my journey from marriage to independence. I'd learned to see my life as something I participated in rather than something that happened to me. Something I could shape rather than something I had to endure. Fall brought new opportunities and challenges. My publisher wanted to discuss a second book, possibly a more prescriptive work about practical steps women could take to build independence and confidence. The idea both excited and intimidated me. Writing about my own experiences was one thing, but offering advice to others felt like a much bigger responsibility. "You're not claiming to be an expert in anyone else's life," Jennifer pointed out when I expressed my concerns. "You're just sharing what you learned from your own experiences and letting readers decide what applies to their situations." She was right, of course. I wasn't trying to become a guru or therapist, just a woman sharing hard-won wisdom with other women who might find it useful. If my experiences could help someone else recognize their own worth or find courage for difficult decisions, then writing about them seemed not just appropriate, but necessary. Winter that year was mild but long, with gray skies and persistent dampness that made spring feel especially precious when it finally arrived. I spent the quiet months working on my second book, exploring themes of resilience and reinvention, drawing on research as well as personal experience to create a resource that might be genuinely helpful. The process of writing prescriptively was different from writing personally, requiring me to think more systematically about what had helped me change and what might help others in similar situations. I interviewed divorce lawyers, therapists, financial advisors, and other women who'd rebuilt their lives after long marriages, gathering insights that went beyond my own limited perspective. One theme that emerged clearly from my research was the importance of community, of finding people who could support and validate your growth rather than trying to keep you in familiar patterns. My friendships with Patricia and David and Susan, my relationship with Mrs. Liu, my connections with other writers and gardeners and volunteers, all of these had been crucial to my ability to see myself as valuable and capable. "Isolation is the enemy of growth," one therapist told me. "When we're isolated, we can only see ourselves through the lens of existing relationships, which may not reflect our full potential. New relationships, especially with people who meet us as we are becoming rather than as we have been, can mirror back possibilities we might not otherwise recognize." By spring of my 77th year, I'd completed the first draft of Building Your Own Garden, a guide to late-life independence and growth. The title reflected both my literal gardening experiences and the metaphorical cultivation of a life aligned with your own values and preferences. The garden itself was thriving in its 6th season under my care, producing not just vegetables and flowers but a sense of competence and connection to the natural world that fed my soul in ways I was still discovering. Mrs. Liu and I had become unofficial mentors to newer gardeners, sharing practical knowledge and emotional encouragement with people who were just beginning their own cultivation journeys. One afternoon, as I was harvesting cherry tomatoes and basil for dinner, a young woman approached my plot hesitantly. She looked to be in her 40s, well-dressed but tired, carrying herself with the hunched shoulders of someone who'd been criticized too often. "Excuse me," she said. "I heard about your book from someone at the library. I was wondering, do you think it's too late for someone my age to start over?" 40-something and asking if it was too late to start over. I looked at her, seeing myself 5 years earlier, but also seeing possibilities she couldn't yet imagine for herself. "I started over at 71, I said gently. "I don't think it's ever too late if you're still breathing and capable of making choices." We talked for an hour in my garden, sharing stories and perspectives while the afternoon light slanted through the leaves and painted everything golden. Her name was Jennifer, not to be confused with my writing instructor, and she was struggling with a marriage that had gradually eroded her sense of self-worth and agency. I feel like I'm disappearing, she said, like I'm becoming invisible even to myself. That's a good sign, I said. A good sign? Feeling invisible means you still remember what it's like to be visible. The real danger is when you stop noticing the invisibility, when it starts feeling normal. By the time she left, Jennifer had taken notes on some of the resources I'd found helpful and had committed to taking one small step toward reclaiming her voice, signing up for a class she'd been interested in, but her husband had dismissed as unnecessary. One small step, I reminded her. You don't have to change everything at once. You just have to start trusting your own instincts about what you need. Interactions like that one reminded me why writing and speaking about my experiences felt important, despite my natural introversion and preference for privacy. If sharing my story could help women like Jennifer recognize their own worth and possibilities, then the discomfort of publicity was a small price to pay. That summer, my second book was accepted for publication, scheduled for release the following year. I was also invited to speak at a conference for life coaches and therapists about working with women going through late-in-life transitions, an opportunity that both honored my expertise and challenged me to think more systematically about what I'd learned. The conference was held in Chicago, my first time visiting the city, and I was nervous about speaking to an audience of professionals rather than women sharing similar experiences. But the presentation went well, and the questions afterward showed me that even experts in human behavior were hungry for authentic stories about resilience and transformation. One therapist approached me during the break to say, "Your story illustrates something we see often but don't always know how to address. The way long-term relationships can gradually erode someone's sense of agency and self-worth, sometimes without anyone consciously intending harm." Without anyone consciously intending harm. That phrase stayed with me, capturing something important about my marriage to Harold. He hadn't set out to make me feel invisible. He'd just organized our relationship around assumptions about gender roles and natural abilities that made my perspectives seem less important than his. The harm had been real, but the intention had been complex. Understanding that distinction was important for my own healing and for the advice I gave to other women. It was possible to acknowledge damage without demonizing the person who'd caused it, to take responsibility for your own choices without accepting blame for circumstances beyond your control. Fall of my 77th year brought unexpected news from Michael. Harold had suffered another heart attack, more serious this time, and wasn't expected to recover. His new wife was overwhelmed, and our children were trying to coordinate care and end-of-life decisions from a distance. "I'm not asking you to get involved," Michael said when he called to tell me. "I know you've moved on with your life, but I thought you should know in case you wanted to. I don't know, say goodbye or something." Did I want to say goodbye to Harold? The question followed me for days as I considered what, if anything, I owed to the man I'd been married to for 53 years. We'd shared so much history, created 2 children together, weathered decades of ordinary mornings and extraordinary challenges, but we'd also hurt each other deeply, and I'd worked hard to build a life that didn't revolve around his needs or preferences. Going to see him now felt like it could undo some of the emotional progress I'd made, could pull me back into old patterns of caretaking and self-sacrifice. In the end, I decided on a middle path. I wrote Harold a letter, something he could read if he was conscious enough, something his family could read to him if he wasn't. The letter was honest about our history together, both the good and the difficult parts. But it was also a goodbye that honored what we'd shared without promising more than I could give. "Dear Harold," I wrote, "I'm sorry to hear about your illness. Whatever our marriage became, it began with love and hope, and it gave us 2 wonderful children who have grown into remarkable adults. I wish you peace during this difficult time, and I hope you know that the good memories we made together will always be part of who I am." Harold died 3 days after I sent the letter. Sarah called to tell me, her voice thick with grief and exhaustion. He'd been unconscious for the final 24 hours, but his wife said she'd read my letter to him while he could still hear. "Thank you for writing to him," Sarah said. I think it meant something to him to know you didn't hate him. I didn't hate Harold. That was true. I'd been angry with him, disappointed in him, hurt by his choices and attitudes. But hate required more emotional energy than I was willing to invest in someone who was no longer part of my life. Indifference could be its own form of forgiveness. The funeral was small, mostly family and his golf buddies, held at a chapel near the club where he'd remarried. I went, not for Harold but for my children, who needed support during their grief and who still saw me as part of their family history even after the divorce. Sitting in that chapel, listening to people talk about Harold's professional success and his love of golf, I felt like I was hearing about a stranger. The man they described bore little resemblance to the husband I'd lived with for 5 decades, not because they were lying, but because I'd never seen the person Harold was away from home, the person he showed to colleagues and friends. Maybe that was part of what had gone wrong in our marriage. We'd never learned to show each other the full range of who we were as individuals, only the narrow roles we'd adopted as husband and wife. I'd been Mrs. Harold Kowalski for so long that I'd forgotten I was also Margaret, with interests and opinions and capabilities that existed independently of my relationship to him. After the service, people shared memories and condolences, treating me with the respectful sympathy due to a longtime widow rather than the ex-wife who'd left years earlier. I appreciated their kindness, but I also felt the surreal distance between their perception of my loss and my actual experience of Harold's death. I wasn't mourning a beloved husband. I was marking the end of a chapter that had already been closed, acknowledging the death of someone who had once been central to my life, but who had become peripheral to my daily experience. It was sad in the way any death is sad, but it wasn't devastating. That night, alone in my apartment, I did something I hadn't expected to do. I got out old photo albums and looked through pictures of Harold and me during the early years of our marriage. Young and hopeful, arms around each other, faces bright with possibility. Looking at those pictures, I could remember what it had felt like to believe we were building something together, to see our future as a shared project requiring mutual effort and compromise. The young woman in those photos had genuinely loved the young man beside her, had believed they would grow old together as partners and companions. We had grown old together, but not as partners. Somewhere along the way, our shared project had become his individual project with me as supporting cast. The love had remained, but it had become constrained by assumptions about capability and authority that had made true partnership impossible. I cried that night, not for the man Harold had become, but for the relationship we might have had if we'd both been willing to grow and change together. The grief was real but clean, uncomplicated by regret about my choice to leave. I mourned what we'd lost without wishing I could get it back. Spring came again. My 8th spring as a divorced woman. My 7th spring in the apartment. My 6th spring in the garden. The rhythms of renewal felt both familiar and miraculous. Evidence that life continues and evolves even after significant losses and changes. Mrs. Liu's health was declining, and she needed more help with her garden plot. I took over some of her heavier work, just as she'd taught me when I was learning. The circular nature of our friendship, teacher becoming student, becoming teacher again, reminded me of how all meaningful relationships change and deepen over time. "Garden teach us everything," she said one afternoon as we transplanted seedlings she'd started in her apartment. When to plant, when to wait, when to let go. When to let go. I thought about those words often in the weeks following Harold's death, recognizing the wisdom in knowing when to release things that had served their purpose, when to stop fertilizing relationships or hopes that were no longer bearing fruit. My second book was published that spring, and the responses were even more enthusiastic than they'd been for my memoir. Women wrote to tell me how the practical exercises had helped them identify their own needs and preferences, how the step-by-step approach had made change feel manageable rather than overwhelming. One letter particularly touched me, from a woman in her 50s who'd been married for 30 years to a man who managed all their finances without consulting her. I started with baby steps like you suggested, she wrote. I opened my own savings account and started depositing $20 a week from my part-time job. It felt like the most radical thing I'd ever done. Now, 6 months later, I have my own credit card, my own bank statements, and my first real conversation with my husband about wanting to be included in financial decisions. He was surprised but not angry. I think he just never realized I wanted to be involved. Thank you for showing me that I could start where I was instead of waiting until I felt brave enough for bigger changes. Letters like that one reminded me that courage wasn't a prerequisite for change. It was a result of change, built through small acts of self-advocacy and gradual expansion of comfort zones. You didn't have to feel brave to make brave choices. You just had to make them, and the courage would develop through practice. That summer, I turned 78 in a celebration that felt like a culmination of everything I'd learned about creating community and honoring my own preferences. Instead of a traditional party, I organized an afternoon gathering in the community garden, inviting everyone who'd been important to my journey toward independence and visibility. Sarah and her family came, of course, along with Michael and his family. My friends from the writing group and literacy program attended, as did neighbors from the garden and women I'd met at book events. Mrs. Liu brought homemade dumplings despite her arthritis, and Patricia brought paintings she'd made at her art classes. We ate potluck food at picnic tables surrounded by vegetables and flowers, sharing stories and laughter and the kind of intergenerational fellowship that makes life feel rich and meaningful. Looking around at the diverse group of people who'd chosen to celebrate with me, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the community I'd built through years of showing up authentically and consistently. "Happy birthday, Grandma," Emma said as we cleaned up afterward. "This party was perfect. It felt like you. It felt like me. From a granddaughter who'd known me through my transformation from invisible housewife to published author, from dependent spouse to independent woman, that was the highest compliment I could imagine." That evening, sitting on my balcony with a glass of wine and a view of the sunset, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 years since I'd found Harold's laptop and discovered how much of my life had been hidden from me. 7 years since I'd moved out and started learning to trust my own judgment. 4 years since the divorce was finalized and I'd begun building a life entirely of my own choosing. The woman I was at 78 bore little resemblance to the woman I'd been at 70, even though the external facts of my life, age, family, basic circumstances, hadn't changed dramatically. What had changed was my relationship with myself, my understanding of my own worth and capabilities, my willingness to prioritize my own growth and happiness. I'd learned that it's never too late to become visible to yourself, never too late to start trusting your own perceptions and making choices based on your own values rather than other people's expectations. I'd learned that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act according to your values despite fear. I'd learned that community can be chosen as well as inherited, and that the quality of relationships matters more than their longevity. Most importantly, I'd learned that a life lived authentically, even if it begins late, is worth every moment of discomfort required to create it. As the sun set over Queens and the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, I raised my glass in a toast to the woman I'd become and the woman I was still becoming. The future stretched ahead of me, not as a series of obligations and expectations to be endured, but as a canvas of possibilities to be explored. At 78, I was finally just getting started. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever wondered what might be possible if you trusted your own judgment and made choices based on your own values? Sometimes the most important transformations begin not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet decisions, to see yourself clearly and honor what you see. Share your story in the comments below. I read every one and find wisdom in all of them. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to help me keep sharing these conversations about courage, growth, and the beautiful possibility of beginning again, no matter what age you are.